Lake Mead is sitting at 1,041.10 feet above sea level this morning. That is 27% full. It is half a foot above the lowest level ever recorded since the reservoir first filled in the 1930s, and the Bureau of Reclamation's own projection has it going below that record before the end of this year. The largest reservoir in the United States is holding 7,053, 590 acre-feet of water against a capacity of 26,120,000. Today is Sunday, August 2nd, 2026. Here is the scale of what depends on that number. The Colorado River system supplies drinking water to roughly 40 million people across 7 states and Mexico. Lake Mead alone supplies about 90% of the water used by Las Vegas. The system-wide storage across all monitored Colorado River reservoirs is sitting at about 33% of capacity. Lake Mead has dropped 3.39 feet in the past month and 13.04 feet in the past year. And the current storage figure is 39% of the 92-year average for this date. Now, the question in the title of this video has a real answer. And it is not the one most people assume. The cities that lose water first are not the ones closest to the reservoir, and they are not the ones in the driest country. They are the ones with the most recent legal claim to the water. That is the entire logic of this system, and once you understand it, the whole map reorders itself. So let me take this in order. First, what the dam dies actually means, because there are 3 different failure points and they are not the same thing. Then the legal system that decides who gets cut and in what order. Then the 10 cities counted down. And then, at the end, the part that surprises almost everybody, which is that the single city most associated with running out of water in the American imagination is, by the plumbing, the very last one that would. Let's start with the dam itself. Hoover Dam does 3 jobs. It stores water, it regulates the flow of the Colorado River downstream, and it generates hydroelectric power for Nevada, Arizona, and California. Those 3 jobs stop at 3 different water levels, and the distinction matters enormously. The first threshold is 1,050 feet. That is the elevation of the upper gates on the dam's intake towers, and historically it has been treated as the practical floor for reliable power generation. Lake Mead is already below that line. It has been for some time. The second threshold is 950 feet. The Bureau of Reclamation calls this the inactive pool. It is the minimum elevation at which Hoover Dam can generate hydroelectric power at all. Turbine upgrades completed around 2015 and 2016 lowered that threshold somewhat, and the dam can now generate down to roughly that 950-foot mark. Below it, the turbines stop. Water can still be released downstream, it just passes through without producing electricity. That is a very serious event for the power grid across 3 states, but it is not a water supply crisis. Not yet. The third threshold is 895 feet. This is dead pool. It is the elevation of the lowest water outlets, the dam's intake tower's lower gates. Below 895 feet, water physically cannot pass through Hoover Dam by gravity. The reservoir stops being a reservoir and becomes functionally a plug. Nothing goes downstream. Not to Arizona, not to California, not to Mexico. And there is a 4th number that almost nobody mentions, 849 feet. That is dead storage, the point below which no water can be released downstream of Hoover Dam under any circumstances at all. Between 895 and 849, there is water in the lake, but it cannot get out through the dam. So when people say if Hoover Dam dies, what they usually mean is dead pool. 895 feet. From this morning's reading of 1,041.10, that is 146 feet of cushion. Now let me be careful here, because this is where a lot of coverage goes wrong. 146 feet sounds like a lot. Lake Mead has fallen roughly 13 feet in the last year. At that pace, it would take about 11 years. But reservoir decline is not linear. The lake narrows as it drops, so the same volume of water loss produces a larger drop in elevation the lower it gets. And the Bureau of Reclamation's July 2026 most probable projection has Lake Mead at 1,037. 31 feet on December 31st of this year, which is below the July 2022 record low. Federal forecasters have been expecting record lows through 2026 and into 2027, with worst-case scenarios placing the lake near 1,015 feet by the summer of 2027. Nobody credible is projecting dead pool in the next 2 years. What they are projecting is a lake that keeps setting record lows in a system where the rules governing it expire at the end of this year. And there is one more thing about the physical system you need, because Lake Mead's fate is not decided at Lake Mead. Upstream on the Utah-Arizona border, Glen Canyon Dam holds back Lake Powell. Powell has a capacity of 24,300,000 acre-feet against Mead's 26,120,000, and the two are operated as a single coordinated system. Water that reaches Mead arrives largely as releases from Powell, and over the past 5 years, Powell has released an average of 7,750,000 acre-feet a year. Powell is currently holding roughly 26% of its capacity, an even thinner margin than Mead. Its own minimum power pool, the level below which Glen Canyon Dam cannot generate, sits at about 3,490 feet, and its dead pool is around 3,370. Federal officials have floated reducing releases from Powell in order to protect the pool behind Glen Canyon Dam, and that decision ripples directly downstream. Holding water back at Powell to save its hydropower means less water arriving at Mead. So the two reservoirs are not independent gauges of the same problem. They are two ends of one system in which protecting the upstream one draws down the downstream one. And the number that determines what either of them holds is not measured at a dam at all. It is measured in the mountains of Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah months earlier in feet of snow. One more piece of physics worth knowing, because it explains why storage in the ground is treated so differently from storage behind a dam. Lake Mead loses a very substantial volume every year purely to evaporation off its surface, water that never reaches a tap, a field, or a turbine. In desert heat on a reservoir with that much exposed surface area, that loss is measured in hundreds of thousands of acre-feet annually. It is one of the reasons the system has been shifting toward underground storage wherever it can, and one of the perverse features of a declining reservoir as Mead drops, its surface area shrinks, so evaporation losses fall too. The lake gets marginally more efficient at holding what little it has left. Now to the second thing you need, which is the legal system. This is the part that determines the answer to the question in the title, so stay with me because it is genuinely counterintuitive. Water on the Colorado River is not distributed by need, by population, by proximity, or by how dry a place is. It is distributed by seniority. The oldest claim gets served first, and it gets served in full before the next claim gets a drop. In a shortage, the newest claims are cut to zero before the oldest claims are touched at all. Lawyers call this prior appropriation. Everybody in the basin calls it the law of the river. And there is one specific piece of that history that decides almost everything about who suffers when Lake Mead falls. In 1968, Congress passed the Colorado River Basin Project Act, which authorized construction of the Central Arizona Project, a 336-mile canal system that would carry Colorado River water from Lake Havasu near Parker across the desert to Phoenix and then on to Tucson. Arizona wanted that canal badly. California, which was already using Colorado River water and had the political weight to block the project, had a condition. The condition was this: water delivered through the Central Arizona Project would be junior in priority to California's Colorado River deliveries. Permanently, Arizona agreed because without that agreement, there was no canal, and without the canal, there was no water at all for Central Arizona. That single 1968 concession is why, in every shortage on the Colorado River, Arizona takes the deepest cuts of any state. Under federal law, junior water rights created after 1968, which include most of the Central Arizona Project, must be reduced before California's older rights are touched at all. So let me put concrete numbers on that. Under the current Tier 1 shortage, which the Bureau of Reclamation has kept in effect for calendar year 2026, Arizona loses 512,000 acre-feet annually. Nevada loses 21,000. Mexico loses 80,000. California loses nothing. Under a Tier 2 shortage triggered below 150 feet, Arizona loses 592,000 acre-feet. Nevada loses 25,000. Mexico loses 104,000. California still loses nothing. An acre-foot, by the way, let me define this because it is the unit everything in this world is measured in, is the volume of water that would cover 1 acre of ground to a depth of 1 foot. It is about 326,000 gallons. As a rough rule of thumb, water managers have long used 1 acre-foot as roughly the annual supply for 2 to 3 households, though efficiency improvements have stretched that considerably in most western cities. So Arizona's 512,000 acre-foot cut this year is not an abstraction. That is roughly 18% of the state's entire Colorado River supply and about 30% of what flows through the Central Arizona Project Canal. Now here is how it works inside Arizona because the priority system nests. Within the Central Arizona Project's own service area, water is allocated by priority as well. Tribal water rights sit at the top. Cities and industrial users come next. Non-tribal agriculture sits at the bottom. And you can see exactly what that has meant in practice. The agricultural pool within the Central Arizona Project lost 65% of its allocation in 2022. In 2023, it was cut off entirely. In 2024, it remained at zero. Tribal users over that same period saw no cuts at all in 2022. Then reductions of 7% in 2023 and 6% in 2024. So the sequence in plain terms runs like this. Central Arizona farms lose water first, and they have already lost it. Then Central Arizona cities. Then, only if the shortage is deep enough, California's junior contract holders. Then California's senior agricultural districts. And at every stage, geography has nothing to do with it. Before we go into the cities, let me talk to those of you watching this from outside the basin entirely, from Ohio or Georgia or the Carolinas, because this reaches you in 3 specific ways and none of them involve your tap. The first is food. The Colorado River irrigates farmland that produces the overwhelming majority of North America's winter leafy greens. When you buy lettuce or spinach in January in Cleveland or Atlanta, there is a very high probability it was grown in the Imperial Valley of California or around Yuma, Arizona, with Colorado River water. Reductions to those districts do not show up as empty shelves. They show up as prices. The second is power. Hoover Dam feeds electricity into a grid that serves 3 states, and grids are interconnected. Losing that generation does not black out Ohio, but it changes the economics of power across the West, and those costs move. The third is people. Phoenix and Las Vegas are among the fastest growing metropolitan areas in the country, and a very large number of them are recent arrivals from elsewhere. If you have family in the Southwest, a son in Chandler, a sister who retired to Scottsdale, this is their supply and their property values and their water bills. So here is what I am going to do. I am going to count down the 10 cities most exposed to Colorado River reductions, starting at number 10 and working to number 1. I am ranking these by how much of their supply comes from the Colorado River and what alternatives they hold, using figures from the cities themselves and from Arizona water agencies. And I want you holding on to one thing while we go. Every city on this list is in Arizona. Not one of them is in Nevada, and not one is in California, and that is not because those states are safe. It is because of the 1968 agreement. At the end of this, I am going to explain what actually happens to Las Vegas and Los Angeles, and the Las Vegas answer in particular is the strangest fact in this entire story. Let's begin. Number 10, Phoenix. Phoenix is the largest city on this list by an enormous margin, and it is the one most people would put at number 1. It belongs at number 10, and the reason is diversification. Phoenix draws Colorado River water through the Central Arizona Project, yes, but it also draws from the Salt and Verde rivers through the Salt River Project, a completely separate system with its own dams and its own water rights that do not count against Arizona's Colorado River allocation. Add stored groundwater and reclaimed water, and Phoenix has a genuinely mixed portfolio. Arizona water officials have been fairly direct that Metro Phoenix does not rely entirely on the Colorado River and will most likely keep taps running through the reductions now being negotiated. What changes is cost. Pumping stored groundwater and moving water between systems is more expensive than taking delivery from a canal, and those costs land on ratepayers. Phoenix is also doing something about it institutionally, which I will come back to. Number 9, Mesa. Mesa sits in the same position as Phoenix structurally, a Central Arizona Project allocation supplemented by Salt River Project water and stored groundwater. The Salt River Project has said explicitly that valley cities, including Mesa, will use the Arizona Canal to access stored aquifer water during Colorado River shortages. That is the contingency plan, and it exists and it has been built. The exposure for Mesa is not that the taps stop. It is that a city of 500,000 people is now running on a backup system whose costs are higher and whose long-term sustainability depends on how much water was banked underground during the wet years. Number 8, Chandler. Same structure again, Central Arizona Project water plus Salt River Project supply plus recovered groundwater, with the Arizona Canal as the delivery route during shortage. Chandler is one of the 6 valley cities the Salt River Project named specifically in its shortage contingency planning. What puts Chandler at 8 rather than 10 is growth. The East Valley has added population fast, and every new rooftop is a new claim on a portfolio that is not growing. Number 7, Gilbert. Gilbert is the 4th of the Salt River Project's named cities and follows the same pattern. Colorado River water through the canal, Salt and Verde River water as the fallback, groundwater underneath both. Gilbert went from a farm town to a city of 250,000 people inside a single generation, and that growth happened almost entirely during the period when Colorado River deliveries were assumed to be reliable. Number 6, Peoria. Here the picture starts to change, and this is where the list gets more serious. The Northwest Valley cities, Peoria, Surprise, Goodyear, Buckeye, sit further from the Salt River Project's historic service area. Their Salt and Verde River access is thinner, which means the Central Arizona Project Canal carries proportionally more of their supply. That is the pattern to watch across this whole countdown. The older the city and the closer it sits to the historic Salt River Valley, the better protected it is. The newer the development and the further out on the edge, the more it depends on a canal that runs from Lake Havasu. It is also worth naming the others in that band because they share the same structural position. Surprise, Goodyear and Buckeye all sit out on the western and northwestern edge of the metro area in country that was farmland or open desert within living memory. And all of them grew fastest during exactly the decades when Central Arizona Project water was the obvious supply for new development. Glendale and Queen Creek sit in similar positions on opposite sides of the valley. The Central Arizona Project Canal supplies 19 cities and towns in total across Pima, Pinal, and Maricopa counties. And the ones added latest to that list generally have the least behind them. Number 5, Tucson. Tucson is a special case, and it deserves proper time because it is the most Colorado River-dependent large city in the United States and simultaneously one of the best prepared. Tucson's Central Arizona Project aqueduct was completed in 1993. Before that, according to Tucson Water's own director, the city relied solely on groundwater, and it had pumped that groundwater so hard through the 20th century that springs dried up, the Santa Cruz River stopped flowing, and the land itself began to subside in places, putting buildings and infrastructure at risk. The city bought farmland in the Avra Valley in the 1960s and 70s specifically to retire the water rights and stop the pumping. Tucson's current Central Arizona Project allocation is a little under 145,000 acre-feet a year. Under the range of post-2026 proposals now on the table, Tucson Water could lose as little as 6% or as much as nearly 85% of its Colorado River-based drinking water supply, depending entirely on how deep the overall lower basin cut turns out to be. 85%. Sit with that number for a moment, and here is why Tucson is at 5 and not at 1. For 30 years, Tucson has been taking its Central Arizona Project water and, rather than delivering all of it straight to taps, recharging much of it into the aquifer beneath the city, putting it back into the ground through recharge basins, including a 226-acre recovery site in the southern Avra Valley. That stored water, combined with the native aquifer, amounts to something on the order of 47 years of supply at current use. That is not a solution. It is a very large buffer, and buffers drain. But it means Tucson is one of the few cities on this list that could lose most of its Colorado River delivery and continue functioning while it works the problem. Which brings me to a concept worth explaining properly, because it is the single most important thing Arizona has done about this. Groundwater banking, or aquifer storage and recovery, works like this. In years when surface water is available, a city takes more than it immediately needs and puts the surplus into the ground, either by spreading it in shallow basins and letting it percolate down, or by injecting it directly through wells. The aquifer becomes a savings account. Later, in shortage, the city pumps that water back out. The advantages over a surface reservoir are substantial. Underground water does not evaporate, and evaporation from Lake Mead's surface is measured in hundreds of thousands of acre-feet every year. It does not need a dam. And it cannot be claimed by a downstream state. The limitations are equally real. Recovery is slower than turning a valve. It requires wells, pumps, and treatment capacity that has to be built and paid for in advance. It costs more energy than gravity delivery. And critically, the water has to have been put there in the first place, which means the cities that banked aggressively in the 1990s and 2000s are now in a fundamentally different position from the ones that did not. Arizona built the legal framework for this in 1980 with the Groundwater Management Act, which created active management areas covering Phoenix, Tucson, Prescott, and the Pinal County farming region, with a stated goal of reaching safe yield, putting as much water back into the aquifer as is pumped out. That law is the reason Arizona has a savings account at all. Number 4, Scottsdale. Scottsdale draws about 70% of its water supply from the Colorado River. By the city's own account, roughly 2/3 comes through the Central Arizona Project, treated at its own plant in North Scottsdale. Its allocation runs to roughly 81,000 acre-feet. And here is what puts Scottsdale this high on the list. Recent analysis of Valley water portfolios found that Scottsdale uses more total water than Anthem, Apache Junction, and Cave Creek combined, the 3 communities we are about to reach, which are even more dependent in percentage terms. Scottsdale is a high-consumption city with 70% exposure. That combination is what matters, not the percentage alone. Scottsdale is also the city that provides the clearest real-world illustration of what a shortage decision looks like, and I will come to that in a moment. Number 3, Cave Creek. Cave Creek relies on the Colorado River for about 90% of its water supply. 90%. It sits at the northern edge of the valley, well outside the Salt River Project's historic service area, and its options are correspondingly narrow. Number 2, Apache Junction. Apache Junction sits just below 100% dependence on the Colorado River. It is on the far eastern edge of the metro area at the foot of the Superstition Mountains, and it grew through exactly the period when Central Arizona Project water was the obvious and cheapest supply for a new community. Number 1, Anthem. Anthem relies on Colorado River water for 100% of its supply, all of it. There is no Salt River Project allocation, no meaningful alternative surface source, and a master planned community built in the 1990s on the assumption that the canal would deliver. That is the top of the list. And I want to be precise about what it means, because it does not mean Anthem's taps stop tomorrow. Under the Lower Basin Plan currently pending before the federal government, cities taking Central Arizona Project water would face cuts of about 14% in 2027 and 2028, with tribal users at about 10%. Those are manageable numbers. But that plan is a proposal, not a decision. The Bureau of Reclamation has modeled deeper options, and Central Arizona Project officials have said publicly that one of the alternatives on the table would cut virtually all Central Arizona Project deliveries to Arizona, while 2 others would cut them by 77% and 82% respectively. A 90% cut to a community that is 100% dependent is a different kind of event from a 14% cut. Now let's slow down, because this is where the numbers stop being numbers. In 2023, an unincorporated area called Rio Verde Foothills in Maricopa County lost its water. Not gradually, the deliveries stopped. The community had been established through widespread splitting of development lots in a way that let homes be legally built without a documented water supply, and residents had been buying hauled water routed through Scottsdale. Scottsdale cut that supply off because it had concluded it needed the water for its own residents. People in Rio Verde spent months buying water at sharply increased prices from further away, rationing household use and negotiating for a fix. A supply was eventually arranged. But Phoenix's own water resources advisor has cited Rio Verde specifically as the outcome Arizona cities are now organizing to avoid repeating. I want to be careful about how that story gets read. It is not an indictment of Scottsdale, which was making a decision about its own resident supply, and it is not an indictment of Rio Verde's residents who bought homes in good faith. It is an illustration of a mechanism. When water gets short, the entity holding the contract serves its own first, and whoever is at the end of the chain finds out what that means. Then there are the farms, and this is the part of the story that has already happened while most of the country was not watching. The Central Arizona Project's non-tribal agricultural pool went from a 65% cut in 2022 to zero water in 2023 and zero again in 2024. Those are farms in Pinal County, between Phoenix and Tucson, growing cotton, alfalfa, grain. Some of those operations have been in the same families for 3 and 4 generations. Researchers using satellite imagery have been able to watch the difference between neighboring irrigation districts, one with junior rights, one with senior tribal rights, show up as fields going brown on one side of a line and staying green on the other. Agriculture consumes about 72% of Arizona's water. Cities and towns use 22%. Industry uses 6%. So when you hear that cities face a 14% cut, understand what has already been absorbed upstream of that number to make it 14 rather than 50. And the tribes. Tribal water rights on the Colorado River are among the most senior in the entire system. Established under a legal doctrine dating to 1908, and for most of the 20th century they were not honored in practice. That has changed substantially, and it is why tribal users took no cuts in 2022 and single-digit percentage cuts afterwards, while farms next door went to zero. It is one of the few places in this story where the oldest claim is finally being treated as the oldest claim. Now, on the response, because there is one and it is substantial. The lower basin states have been conserving water in Lake Mead voluntarily since at least 2014 through mechanisms called intentionally created surplus and system conservation, essentially taking less than your entitlement and leaving the difference in the reservoir, sometimes compensated, sometimes not. Arizona's contributions to Lake Mead alone have exceeded 5.5 million acre-feet since 2014. In 2023, lower basin consumptive use was the lowest it had been since 1983. Southern Nevada has run one of the most aggressive municipal conservation programs in the country. In 2023, Southern Nevada used less Colorado River water than in any of the previous 31 years, while its population continued to grow. Nevada's consumptive use finished 2024 at 212,400 acre-feet against a basic allocation of 300,000. And Arizona's cities are now building institutions. Phoenix and Tucson are jointly setting up something called the Secure Water Arizona Program, SWAP, which has 2 main components. The first is an emergency reserve, a break glass supply a city can access if it is running short in a hurry and needs to bridge to a longer-term fix. The second is an exchange where willing buyers and willing sellers of water, cities, farming districts, mining companies can transact through a common marketplace rather than negotiating one-to-one every time. The reasoning is straightforward. Every city in central and southern Arizona holds a different mix of supplies: Central Arizona project water, groundwater, treated effluent, salt and Verde River rights. No single solution fits all of them. A marketplace lets each one solve its own shortfall. Now let me close the loop I opened at the start, because this is the part almost nobody knows. Las Vegas draws roughly 90% of its water directly out of Lake Mead. It is the city in the American imagination most associated with running out of water. By the plumbing, it is the last major city in the lower basin that would. Here is why. Every other municipal user in the lower basin takes delivery downstream of Hoover Dam. The Central Arizona Project Canal starts at Lake Havasu near Parker, which is below Hoover. The Colorado River Aqueduct that carries water to Southern California starts at Lake Havasu as well. Both of those systems depend on water passing through Hoover Dam and continuing downriver. Las Vegas does not. The Southern Nevada Water Authority takes its water out of Lake Mead itself above the dam. And starting in 2008, Southern Nevada built for exactly this scenario. Intake number 3, the project everyone calls the third straw, is a deep tunnel and intake that began delivering water in September 2015, paired with a low lake level pumping station designed to lift water from far below the old intakes. The intake sits at around 860 feet, with the pumping station able to draw down to roughly 875. Dead pool at Hoover Dam is 895 feet. So in the scenario where Lake Mead falls below 895 and nothing passes through Hoover Dam, no water to Arizona, no water to California, no water to Mexico, Southern Nevada could still be drawing water out of the lake. The Southern Nevada Water Authority states this plainly as the purpose of the project, to ensure access to supplies below dead pool elevation, the point at which no water can pass through Hoover Dam to generate power or meet downstream demands. That is a genuinely strange outcome, baked into the concrete. The state with the smallest allocation on the river, 300,000 acre-feet. About 4% of the lower basin total is the one with physical access when the dam stops working. I want to be careful not to oversell it, because a deeper intake does not create water. If Lake Mead is at 880 feet, the Colorado River system has effectively collapsed as a functioning water supply, and southern Nevada would be drawing from a shrinking pond with no meaningful inflow, while every economy it trades with had already failed. Nevada's advantage is measured in time, not in safety. But the time is real, and it was bought deliberately at a cost of over $1 billion by people who took the projections seriously when it was unfashionable to do so. It is worth adding that California's protection is not evenly distributed inside California either. The state's own Colorado River rights are ranked internally, and the most senior of them belong to agriculture, not to cities, principally the Imperial Irrigation District in the far southeast corner of the state, which holds one of the oldest and largest claims on the entire river. The Metropolitan Water District, which wholesales water to Los Angeles, San Diego, and much of the coastal south, sits junior to those agricultural districts within California's own stack. So if California ever does have to absorb a mandatory reduction, the internal order runs the same way it does everywhere else on this river. The newest claim goes first, and the newest large claim in California belongs to the cities, not the farms. That is the reverse of what most people would guess, and it is the same principle that put Anthem at number 1 on this list. And Los Angeles and San Diego, different protection entirely, legal rather than physical. California holds the most senior rights in the lower basin, and under the current framework, it takes no mandatory reduction under Tier 1 or Tier 2 shortage. Southern California cities have been substantially insulated. But the protection is contractual, and it stops at the water's edge. If Lake Mead reaches dead pool, seniority becomes irrelevant. Because the Colorado River Aqueduct draws from Lake Havasu, and Lake Havasu is fed by releases through Hoover Dam. Southern California also draws from the State Water Project out of Northern California, which is why the region has options Arizona's canal-dependent suburbs do not. So the honest summary is this. Under shortage, Arizona's Central Arizona Project cities lose first by a wide margin because of an agreement signed in 1968. Under dead pool, everyone downstream of Hoover loses simultaneously: Arizona, Southern California, and Mexico, while Southern Nevada keeps drawing. Those are two completely different failure modes, and they produce two completely different maps. Now to what happens next, because there is a hard deadline and it is close. The 2007 interim guidelines that have governed how Lake Powell and Lake Mead are operated, together with the 2019 Drought Contingency Plan, expire at the end of 2026. That is 5 months away. Everything I have described about tiers, triggers, and shortage sharing runs on rules that are about to lapse. The Bureau of Reclamation asked the 7 basin states to submit the details of a preliminary operations agreement by mid-November and a final 7-state agreement by mid-February, with the goal of a decision in time to begin implementation in the 2027 operating year. Those negotiations have been difficult and at points deadlocked. What has emerged in the federal planning is a 2-stage structure. For 2027 and 2028, shortages up to 1.5 million acre-feet would be divided according to a proposal the 3 lower division states submitted on May 1st of this year. Anything above 1.5 million acre-feet would fall back to the old priority system, and from 2029 onward. All shortages would follow the priority system unless the states reach new agreements. That distinction is the entire negotiation. A negotiated split shares pain broadly. The priority system does not. It concentrates the pain on the junior rights, which means Arizona. To take the concrete example from the federal modeling, a 1.5 million acre-foot lower basin shortage in 2027 or 2028 would see Arizona give up 760,000 acre-feet and California give up 440,000. Arizona absorbs the clear majority of the reduction, and the hydrology is not cooperating. Federal studies show the river's flow is likely to decrease by around 3 million acre-feet over the next decade. The upper basin snowpack that feeds both reservoirs has come in below average. Lake Powell upstream is holding roughly a quarter of its capacity, which limits how much can be released downstream to prop up Lake Mead. So here is what you can actually do with this depending on where you sit, if you live in one of the cities on this list. The single most useful thing is to find out what your specific utilities supply portfolio looks like. Not your states, not your metro areas, your providers. Every city on this list has a different mix, and the difference between 70% Colorado River dependence and 100% is the difference between an inconvenience and a crisis. That information is published. Your water utility's annual report or water resources plan will state it directly. If you are buying property in central or southern Arizona, ask specifically whether the property has a designated or assured 100-year water supply and who the provider is. Rio Verde foothills happened because homes were legally built without one. That is a documented checkable status, and it is the single most important question about a house in that region that most buyers never ask. If you are already in a shortage-affected area, understand that the near-term impact is far more likely to arrive as cost than as an empty tap. Pumping and recovering banked groundwater costs more than gravity delivery through a canal. Rate increases are the mechanism by which this reaches most households, and they are already being forecast by water officials. And on conservation, outdoor use is where the volume is. In Arizona, up to 70% of residential water use goes outside, landscape irrigation, pools, washing vehicles. Southern Nevada's conservation program, which is the most successful in the region, was built primarily on removing non-functional turf and changing outdoor water use. That is where the savings live, and it is why the desert cities that have made progress made it there rather than in shower timers. So here is the bottom line. Lake Mead this morning, 1,041.10 feet, 27% full, half a foot above the all-time record low, with the Bureau of Reclamation projecting 1,037.31 feet by the end of December. Dead pool is 895 feet, 146 feet below where the lake sits today. Hydropower fails at roughly 950 feet well before that. The Colorado River supplies about 40 million people. Under the Tier 1 shortage in force this year, Arizona gives up 512,000 acre-feet, Nevada 21,000, Mexico 80,000, California nothing. Central Arizona project agriculture has been at zero since 2023. Anthem is 100% dependent on the river, Apache Junction close behind, Cave Creek at 90%, Scottsdale at 70%, and using more water than the three of them combined. Tucson could lose up to 85% of its Colorado River supply against roughly 47 years of banked groundwater. And Las Vegas, the city everyone expects to fail first, has an intake at 860 feet, 35 feet below the level at which Hoover Dam stops working at all. The specific thing worth watching between now and the end of the year is the November deadline. The 7 basin states were asked to deliver the details of a preliminary operations agreement by the middle of November, with a final 7-state agreement due by mid-February. If those deadlines are met, the shortage sharing framework for 2027 and 2028 gets negotiated, and Arizona's cities face something in the range of a 14% cut. If they are not met, the fallback is the priority system, and under the priority system, the junior rights go first. And the junior rights are the canal that supplies every single city I just counted down. That is not a prediction. It is what the 2 published paths actually say. If this kind of breakdown is useful to you, subscribe and turn notifications on, because I track this system and the numbers move every single week. And to everybody in Pinal County who has already been farming without a water allocation for 3 years, to the people in Rio Verde who spent a winter hauling water, and to everyone in the Southwest reading their utility bill a little more carefully,